A car door closed on a Friday morning in October. A 12-year-old girl stepped out of a vehicle near her school, and within minutes, she was gone. Not missing in the way that triggers sirens. Not the kind of disappearance that gets a name on the news that same evening and a search party assembled by nightfall. Gone in the quiet way. The kind that takes days for anyone to officially acknowledge, and by then, the person responsible had already been given all the time in the world to make sure it stayed that way. Her name was Tia Palmer. She was 12 years old. She had been in the foster care system since she was 7. And what happened to her, not just the crime itself, but everything that surrounded it, everything that allowed it to happen, and then allowed it to almost go unseen, is one of the most disturbing cases to come out of Australia in recent memory. Because here is what I need you to understand before anything else. The man who killed Tia Palmer spent the following 6 days helping search for her. He posted on Facebook, he drove around the neighborhood, he stood at her graveside, he helped carry her coffin. And for almost a week, not a single institution, not the police, not social services, not the media, looked at the right things closely enough or fast enough to stop him from doing any of it. This is the story of everything that failed before anyone realized who they were looking for. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Queensland, Australia sits in the northeastern corner of the country. Wide, sun-bleached, and sprawling, in the suburban fringes, towns bleed into each other through long stretches of highway and residential streets that all look more or less the same. Waterford West is one of those places. Quiet, unremarkable. The kind of suburb where nothing happens and where nobody expects it to. It was here, in January of 2015, that Tia Palmer came to live with a family called the Thorburns. To understand what that means, you need to understand how Tia got there. She had been in the foster care system since she was 7 years old. Her mother, Cindy, had made that decision herself. Not because she didn't want her daughter, because she did. Cindy was living through a sustained period of domestic violence, and she understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around her at the time, that keeping Tia close meant exposing her to something no child should have to witness. So she made the call that tore her apart. She placed her daughter with strangers. She hoped that somewhere further down the line, things would stabilize and they would find their way back to each other. They didn't get that chance. In the years that followed, Tia moved through the system the way children in those situations often do. Placement to placement, carrying more emotional weight with each move than any child her age should have to carry. She and Cindy maintained contact through visits arranged by social services, but as time passed, those visits became harder for Cindy to manage. The guilt of the placement, the ongoing instability in her own life, the slow devastation of depression. She turned to alcohol. The visits became less frequent, and Tia, still a young girl, processing all of it, learned to keep moving. By the time she arrived at the Thorburn house, she was 12 years old, and she had already learned that the world was not a particularly soft place. The Thorburns were, on paper, exactly the kind of placement social services was supposed to be providing. They had taken in foster children before. The system had approved them, trusted them, and continued to fund them. Rick, the father, was described by those who knew him as authoritarian, physically imposing, controlling. The kind of person who kept tight order over his household and made absolutely clear that he was the one running it. He had spent years as a heavy goods vehicle driver before transitioning to selling hot dogs from a stand. Julian, his wife, stayed at home. They had 2 biological sons, Josh, who was 19, and Trent, who was 18. Both were into dance and trained regularly at a local gym. On paper, it looked stable. It looked active. It looked like exactly the kind of family-oriented environment that a 12-year-old girl needed. Cindy had reservations. She raised them. She told the caseworkers that she was uncomfortable with the idea of Tia, a 12-year-old girl, being placed in a home with 2 teenage boys. She wasn't making accusations. She was a mother with an instinct, and she wanted it on record. The response she received was essentially that the boys were old enough to understand appropriate boundaries, and that at their ages, there wouldn't be an issue. That assessment would later prove to be catastrophically wrong. By most accounts, Tia settled in reasonably well at first. She was sociable by nature, warm, already street smart in the particular way that children who've moved around tend to be. She got along with Josh and Trent. She treated them like older brothers, or something close to it. Rick maintained a deliberate distance from the foster children who came through his home. He acknowledged later that he was aware placements were usually temporary, and that attachment came with complications. But there were no reported incidents, no flags, nothing that marked the household as anything other than functional, What was happening beneath the surface of that household was a different story entirely, and it would be several months before anyone outside those four walls understood the full shape of it. The morning of Friday, October 30th, 2015, began the way most mornings at the Thorburn house did. Josh and Trent were up early, they trained at the gym before school and worked most days, and by around 6:15 they were already out the door. Rick and Julian were also up, tending to the animals on the property. They kept horses. The routine of feeding and cleaning out the stalls started early. Tia got herself ready for school. She and Rick left the house together just after 8. The drive to Marsden State High School was short. The school sat near a major road. Intersections and crossings everywhere, not an isolated location by any stretch. Rick dropped Tia off at approximately 8:15 and then continued on to an automotive parts store to pick up supplies. That was the last moment anyone in Tia's life was supposed to have seen her alive. At noon, the school rang the Thorburn house. Julian answered. The school wanted to know why Tia hadn't attended a single class that morning. Julian's reaction, by her own account, was calm, closer to mild concern than alarm. And on the surface, that reaction made a certain kind of sense. Tia had a history of truancy. She had gone missing briefly before, and on each of those occasions the explanation had been the same. She had been trying to make her way back to her mother. It was a pattern the family knew. It was a pattern social services knew. When a child with Tia's history disappears for a few hours, the assumption is almost always that she is running towards something rather than away from it. The standard process was set in motion. Social services were notified. Tia's caseworker was contacted. Cindy received a message warning her that Tia might show up at her door in the coming hours. Rick went to the local police station and reported her missing. The officers who took his report were not particularly concerned. To them, Tia fit a profile they saw regularly, a troubled foster child. History of going off the radar, almost certainly heading toward a family member. The logic seemed sound. She had no money, which meant she'd need public transport. And without a ticket, she'd be stopped at some point and brought in. They told Rick the situation was under control and sent him home. It wasn't under control. Nothing about it was. As the afternoon became evening and the evening became night, Tia still hadn't surfaced. She wasn't at Cindy's. She hadn't contacted anyone. No one had seen her on a bus or at a transit stop. Cindy, who by this point had a growing sense that something was seriously wrong, began pushing hard on police to take the disappearance more seriously. Her daughter, she told them, had always made contact when she ran. She always showed up somewhere within hours. She always reached out. This silence was different. This silence was not something Cindy recognized. The response she got was dismissive. And this is the part I need you to sit with for a moment because it matters to everything that follows. Cindy was a mother who had placed her child in foster care. She had a history of depression and instability. In the eyes of the people handling her calls that evening, she was not the most credible alarm bell. She was the kind of woman whose concern could be explained away. Filed under anxiety, filed under guilt, filed under a mother who had already made one difficult choice and was now perhaps overreacting. She was not overreacting, but nobody was listening yet. The Thorburn family mobilized their own search. Josh and Trent drove around the area after getting back from training, checking the streets, the spots where kids tended to gather. They found nothing. Rick posted in the comments section of a local Facebook page that had shared Tia's missing person notice. He wrote that if any of her friends were hiding her, they needed to do the right thing and let the family know. He sounded, in those comments, like a worried parent, worried and frustrated and desperate to find her. Cindy was also posting online, and the response she received from strangers was what you might expect. If you have spent any time at all around the comment sections of missing persons posts, the same people who had never heard of Tia Palmer 20 minutes earlier were suddenly questioning why Cindy had placed her daughter in foster care, why she wasn't doing more, why she had allegedly abandoned her. She was being publicly flogged for caring about a daughter the state had taken out of her hands, while the people who actually had legal responsibility for that daughter's safety were doing almost nothing. The following days were a near total failure of every institution that should have been paying attention. Social services assumed Tia would show up. The school marked her absent each day and did nothing further. The police continued to treat her as a runaway. Cindy contacted media outlets and asked them to cover the story. She was told they would need to wait for an official police appeal before they could publish anything. Tia's case, at that moment, was not considered compelling enough. Josh and Trent took to parking outside the school in the mornings, watching for any sign of her. Julian commented repeatedly on the Facebook posts, asking people to keep sharing. The Thorburn family presented itself, publicly, as a household in anguish, doing everything it could to find a missing girl they loved like one of their own. 6 days passed, an entire week, And still nothing official. Still no meaningful investigation. Still no media coverage worth speaking of. On the 5th of November, 2015, that changed. At around 5:15 in the afternoon, a call came into Queensland Police from a group of fishermen near the Kingsford Road Bridge, approximately 30 minutes drive from Waterford West. They had found a body near the water, small, clearly a child or a young teenager, in a state of significant decomposition. A team was dispatched immediately. Police vehicles sealed off the area. A helicopter was brought in. Journalists, who had been largely indifferent to the disappearance of a 12-year-old foster child, mobilized fast. The body was female, estimated between 12 and 18 years old, found partially unclothed in the undergrowth near the riverbank. According to the forensic assessment that followed, the body had been there for approximately a week, which placed the time of death on or around the day Tia vanished. At 10:45 that night, a local news outlet published the identification. The body recovered near the Kingsford Road Bridge was that of Tia Lee Palmer, 12 years old. She had been missing for a week. She had died in all likelihood within hours of disappearing, and for 6 of those 7 days the country had been almost entirely unaware she was gone. The Thorburns were notified. Cindy was notified. Whatever fragile hope had sustained them through the previous week collapsed in an instant. Cindy had spent days fighting police, fighting media, fighting strangers on the internet, trying to get anyone to take her daughter seriously. She had done everything available to her, and none of it had been fast enough, or loud enough, or taken seriously enough to matter. The media, which had declined to cover a missing 12-year-old, now had a murdered one. The coverage that followed was extensive, largely horrified. Not just at the crime itself, but at the week of silence that had preceded its discovery. The week during which a murdered child had lain in undergrowth beside a river, 30 minutes from the house she'd been living in, while the person who put her there helped conduct the search. The investigation that began on the 6th of November faced a problem it had largely created for itself. A week had passed since Tia's death. Any witnesses who might have seen something unusual near the Kingsford Road Bridge on the morning of the 30th, a vehicle, a figure, something that struck them as odd, had long since moved on. Memory is not reliable at the best of times, and the best of times had passed 7 days ago. Police began working through the obvious early steps. The Thorburn family was interviewed. All 4 gave consistent accounts. Tia had a history of running. She hadn't seemed upset the morning she disappeared. She had limited internet access, so the possibility of an online contact luring her somewhere seemed remote. Rick confirmed he had dropped her near the school just after 8 in the morning. The family hadn't noticed anything unusual in the days before she vanished. Tia's friends and classmates were also interviewed. Investigators believed that if she had planned to go somewhere, or arranged to meet someone, she would have said something to at least one person. But no one had heard anything. No name, no meeting, no plan. Tia hadn't breathed a word to anyone about going anywhere. Known offenders in the area were pulled in for questioning. Records were checked. Alibis were verified. None of it went anywhere. Then, at a press conference led by the investigation's lead detective, Dave Hutchinson, a journalist asked a question that stopped the room. He asked whether anyone had actually confirmed that Rick Thorburn had dropped Tia off at school on the morning of her disappearance, whether there was a witness, a camera, anything that independently placed her at that location. Hutchinson's answer was careful but telling. They had checked the available information, and everything seemed consistent with Rick's account. But no, they had not yet independently confirmed it. A week into the investigation of a murdered 12-year-old, no one had verified whether the last person to see her had actually done what he said he did. A reward of $250,000 was announced. 2 officers were assigned specifically to review the CCTV footage from cameras around the school and the surrounding road network on the morning of the 30th. The aim was simple: find Rick's car, find the moment he stopped, find Tia stepping out, confirm the story, and move on. What they found instead changed everything. Rick's car appeared on camera in the vicinity of the school that morning, right around the time he had always described. But the car did not stop. No door opened. No one got out. The car slowed, passed in front of the school, and then continued on without pulling over. The investigators followed the footage, camera to camera, junction to junction. They traced the route Rick's car took after passing the school. It went toward the Kingsford Road Bridge. On the 14th of November, Tia Palmer was buried. Roughly 1,000 people attended the funeral. Local businesses had produced t-shirts bearing her name. Flowers surrounded the coffin, balloons were released. The turnout was, in its own complicated way, a reflection of the guilt the community felt about the week of silence that had preceded the discovery of her body, a collective acknowledgement that she had deserved more attention than she received while she was still alive to benefit from it. Rick Thorburn was among the pallbearers. He helped carry her coffin to the grave. Photographs of him doing so were published in newspapers across the country. Cindy, meanwhile, was doing press. She had agreed to give interviews in the hope of keeping attention on the case and pressure on investigators. The interviews did not go the way she might have hoped, not because of anything she did wrong, but because the media had already decided how grief was supposed to look. Cindy didn't cry on camera. She spoke clearly and with composure. She didn't collapse, and the media, which had already demonstrated a limited appetite for nuance, decided that a grieving mother who didn't sob on cue was worth scrutinizing rather than listening to. Journalists asked why she had placed Tia in foster care. They asked whether she felt responsible. They asked, with varying degrees of tact, what right she had to be publicly grieving a daughter she had, in their framing, walked away from. She kept showing up anyway. She came to the school. She handed out bracelets and t-shirts. She kept talking. She kept pushing. The investigation moved slowly through the remainder of 2015 and into 2016. There was a search of a derelict property that produced nothing, periodic updates that amounted to very little. The case developed the quiet weight of something that might go cold. Then, on the 10th of May 2016, 6.5 months after Tia's death, a woman called the investigation team and asked to speak anonymously. She said she was a family friend. She said she knew things about the Thorburns. She said she was afraid of what would happen to her if her identity became known, but that she wanted investigators to hear what she had to say. She told them 2 things. The first was that Trent Thorburn had been in a sexual relationship with Tia, and that Tia may have been pregnant at the time of her death. The second was that on the night of October 30th and into the early hours of October 31st, the night Tia disappeared, the entire Thorburn family had met and constructed a unified story, a set of answers to questions they expected investigators would eventually ask. The call ended. The investigators sat with what they had just heard. A formal interview of the entire family was arranged for the 27th of June. Rick, Julian, Josh, and Trent were brought in separately and questioned with the same set of questions. What was their relationship with Tia like? Had there been serious arguments? How had she seemed in the days before she disappeared? Did any of them have any involvement in her death? All 4 gave essentially the same answers. Tia had been a good kid. Some issues, the truancy, the occasional stubbornness, but nothing serious. They had looked for her. They had been desperate to find her. They had no involvement in what happened to her. Rick, in particular, kept returning to one word when he described Tia on the morning of October 30th. Happy. She had been happy that morning, he was sure of it. Happy when she got in the car. Happy when they drove. Happy when he dropped her off. Happy. Investigators let the family go. But something about the interviews sat wrong. The consistency was too clean. The composure too complete. Most people, even entirely innocent people, show some degree of stress in a formal police interview. A fidget. A pause at the wrong moment. A sentence that starts and then restarts itself. The Thorburns showed none of that. They answered questions the way people answer questions when they have already worked out what the right answers are and rehearsed them enough times to deliver them without hesitating. The anonymous caller was eventually identified through the investigation. She was an aunt of Josh and Trent, a woman the boys trusted and had confided in. She was brought in quietly in a way that wouldn't alert Rick if he was monitoring who was speaking to police. She showed the investigators her phone. On it were Facebook messages from Trent, sent 2 days before Tia disappeared, on October 28, 2015. In those messages, Trent told his aunt that he and Tia had been sexual with each other. He said she had been complaining of stomach pains in recent days, and he was frightened she might be pregnant. He said he would rather die than have his family find out what had happened. He said he wanted her gone, but that she was a source of income for his parents through the foster care payments, and he couldn't risk that going away. And at the end of that conversation, his aunt had told him to be honest with his parents, to think carefully about what he needed to say and tell them the truth. The messages were not sufficient on their own to charge anyone with murder. They demonstrated motive. They did not demonstrate the act. Investigators needed more. In August of 2016, while the Thorburn family was away on holiday, investigators entered the family home and installed audio surveillance equipment. When the family returned, police called and told them they were wanted for a follow-up interview on the 19th of September. The microphones recorded everything that happened between that phone call and the day they were due to come in. Rick coached Trent on what to say about his relationship with Tia, the specific words to use, the framing to present, the parts of the story to emphasize, the parts to leave out. All of it was recorded. Julian was picked up separately by the microphones talking to Josh. She was not confessing, she was calculating, working out how much she could hand over if it came to it, and how much she needed to hold back to protect herself. She made it clear that if Rick went down, she was prepared to give investigators what they needed to make sure she didn't go down with him. The interview on the 19th of September proceeded accordingly. Josh broke first. When investigators raised the relationship between Trent and Tia, he gave them their first direct, explicit acknowledgement that something real had happened inside the Thorburn house. It wasn't everything, but it was enough of a crack to work with. Julian was more guarded, but in the way she talked around things rather than through them, she made clear enough that Rick was responsible for Tia's death, and that she had known it for a long time. The whole family was taken into custody, with each member of the family now separated from the others and facing the full weight of what the investigation had gathered. The truth came out in pieces. What investigators were able to reconstruct from the testimonies of Josh, Trent, and Julian was this. On the night of October 29, 2015, Trent came to his mother and told her about the relationship with Tia. He told her about the stomach pains, about his fear that she was pregnant, about the fact that he had already told his aunt. He was panicked. Julian's response, according to the accounts provided later, was to tell him that they would handle it. That evening, Josh and Trent left the house for their dance class. Julian told Rick what Trent had told her. She then left to visit the aunt, the same woman who had already been told what Trent had done, and who Rick was now apparently trying to neutralize before she could do any more damage. Julian told Tia to go to bed. Rick was alone in the house with Tia. When Julian returned later that evening, Josh and Trent arrived home at approximately the same time. All three of them asked Rick how Tia was. He told them everything had been taken care of. He told them not to ask questions. He said he had handled it. Julian went to Tia's bedroom. The door was locked. Rick told her not to go in. He told her tomorrow would be a normal day. Tia was already dead on the other side of that door. The cause of death was never precisely determined. The forensic examination of the property found no blood, no evidence of a struggle in the conventional sense. What that absence most likely indicates is that Tia was smothered. She was a 12-year-old girl. She had gone to bed as she was told. She had no reason to expect what was coming. Rick later wrote a letter claiming it had been an accident. He said he had followed her outside after an argument, grabbed her to stop her from leaving, covered her mouth to stop her from screaming, and that she had simply stopped breathing. He described the moment he realized she was unresponsive the way someone describes a mechanical failure. Something went wrong. He hadn't meant for it to happen that way. Almost no one who read that letter believed it. The following morning, October 30th, 2015, Rick loaded Tia's body into his vehicle and drove to the Kingsford Road Bridge. He intended to put her in the river. He intended for the current to carry her far enough away that no immediate connection to his house would be made. But the current didn't cooperate. Tia's body came to rest in the undergrowth near the bank, beneath the bridge, where 6 days later a group of fishermen would find her. Rick drove back toward town. He passed in front of Marsden State High School at the time he would normally have dropped Tia off. He didn't stop. He drove past slowly enough to appear on CCTV, and then he continued on toward an automotive parts store. He told Julian he had dropped Tia at school. He told Josh and Trent the same thing. He organized the entire family around the performance of concern. The Facebook posts, the public appeals, the nights driving around the neighborhood looking for a girl they all knew would not be found. When Cindy raised alarms, the Thorburns raised alarms alongside her. When the media was eventually contacted, the family was visibly, publicly devastated, a household in anguish, doing everything it could. Julian was convicted on charges related to concealing the murder and covering for her husband. She received an 18-month sentence and served 6. She told the court she had stayed silent to protect her family. She said that after what had happened, she no longer considered Rick her husband. Josh was convicted of concealing the murder. He received a 3-month sentence. Trent was convicted on charges related to the sexual abuse of a minor and providing false information. He received a 4-year sentence and served considerably less. The question of what had actually happened between Trent and Tia, whether it had been statutory rape or something more coercive than even that, was not fully addressed during the proceedings. Tia was dead. She could not give her account. Trent's version, that Tia had initiated contact and had threatened his dog to ensure his compliance, was the version that shaped how his charges were framed. Other children who had passed through the Thorburn home had reportedly made allegations that were never fully pursued. Those threads were not picked up the way they perhaps should have been. Rick's case took longer. He was held from September 2016, but his trial did not begin until May 2018. In the 2 years between, his account of events shifted repeatedly. He confessed, then recanted. He said he had killed her, but couldn't remember how. He said he was innocent and that the entire case was a construction designed to destroy him. He claimed, after being assaulted by other prisoners, that the physical shock had somehow restored his memory. And he submitted that letter describing Tia's death as accidental suffocation during a struggle at the front door. At the trial itself, Rick was hostile from the beginning. He insulted the psychologist assigned to assess him. He told the judge that the outcome was already decided. He was right about that much. The evidence against him was by then overwhelming, but wrong about almost everything else. He attempted suicide during the proceedings, using medication he had obtained while in custody. He survived. On the 25th of May, 2018, Rick Thorburn was convicted of the murder of Tia Lee Palmer. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period extending to 2036. Before the sentence was read, Rick addressed the court. He said he knew he would never see the outside of a prison again. He said he was sorry. He said sorry couldn't undo the pain he had caused. The man who had carried Tia's coffin to her grave was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a cell. Cindy spoke after the verdict. She said Rick needed to accept responsibility for what he had done. She said she felt no sympathy for him or for anyone in his family. She said Tia had been a beautiful girl with her whole life ahead of her, and that Rick had taken that life away. She had spent years being publicly questioned about whether she had the right to grieve her own daughter, accused of abandonment by strangers who knew nothing about her circumstances. She had placed Tia with a family that the state had approved, trusted, and continued to fund, and that family had killed her. Cindy had raised alarms that no one listened to for an entire week while her daughter's body lay in undergrowth beside a river 30 minutes from home. She kept going anyway. She kept talking. She kept pushing. She had been doing it since October 31st, 2015, when she first understood that something was wrong. And she was still doing it in May 2018, when the court finally confirmed what she had suspected long before the rest of the country was paying attention. As for the Thorburns who walked free, they dispersed quietly into ordinary life. Julian changed her appearance when she went out, wearing wigs and nondescript clothing to avoid recognition. Trent altered his look. Different hairstyle, different build. Josh changed his hair color. Smaller adjustments, but adjustments all the same. The kind of small changes that people make when they're trying to move through the world without being recognized as who they actually are. Tia Palmer was 12 years old. She was placed in a home the state had approved, trusted, and continued to fund. She was failed by social services who assumed she would show up. Failed by police who treated her as a runaway statistic. Failed by media who decided she wasn't a compelling enough story. Failed by the adults who were legally responsible for her safety, and who chose instead to protect themselves. She died the same day she disappeared, and the country didn't find out for a week. And for that entire week, the man who killed her helped search for her. He drove past her school. He posted on Facebook. He stood at the graveside. He helped carry the coffin. He said the right things at the right times to the right people. And nobody looked at him closely enough, or quickly enough, or at the right things. Until someone finally did. And that someone wasn't a detective. It wasn't a senior officer. It wasn't a caseworker or a journalist or anyone with an official role in any of the institutions that had failed Tia from the beginning. It was a woman sitting on a couch, looking at messages on her phone. Messages a frightened 18-year-old boy had sent her 2 days before a 12-year-old girl died, who decided that she was not going to delete them, no matter what she was told. She took the screenshots, she kept them, and when the moment came, she handed them over. That decision is the reason Rick Thorburn is in a cell. Let us know in the comments what you think about the way the institutions handled this case, and whether you think the sentences the rest of the family received were anywhere near enough. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching.